everyone, and welcome. Welcome to what I hope is going to be an unusual conversation with a pretty bold title, I think. Bold Moves for Gender Equity. My name is Paulette Senior. I'm the President and CEO of the Canadian Women's Foundation. And I have some extraordinary panelists here with me that you're about to hear from. But perhaps I can just say a couple opening comments with regards to why we're having this important conversation this afternoon and why now. So we're facing a number of shifts. I think this conversation over the past 3 days has really been about looking at what's to come in the future in the economy, but everything I think is about the economy, including gender equity. And we've certainly had some disruption, whether it's in health and care, as we just heard about, but other areas. And it is no different when we're talking about gender equity and gender equality overall. And so this conversation is looking at what it is that we need to do now, but also what's being done now at a number of different corporations, and my esteemed panelists are going to be able to share that with you, as well as what it is that we hope to accomplish in a bold way that will generate greater equity in corporations, but certainly in society overall. So let me just now welcome my co-panelists. I will start with, well, maybe what I'll do, I will share a little bit about the Canadian Women's Foundation, because I understand there are people out there, for some strange reason, don't know who we are. So let me say that we are Canada's public foundation for gender equality, where we work with women, girls, and gender diverse people to move them out of poverty, out of violence, and into confidence and leadership. So that's who we are. We do it well. We've been doing it for over 30 years. And we work with corporations just like folks here to support women, girls, and gender diverse people to do just that in their lives across the country. So the folks who are going to help me to talk about this today, let me begin first with Sonja Volpe, who is immediately to my left. And not only is she a mover and shaker in audiences just like this, but she's the CEO of BNP Paribas in Canada, and someone that I'm looking forward to hear about the bold moves that she's making at her organization. Following and sitting beside her is Megan Roach, who I had the pleasure of meeting earlier this week as well. She's the CEO of, President and CEO of Roots Corporation, and I think you'll be enthralled by some of the things that they're putting into place. Followed by Teralyn Devonish, who is the Chief Legal Officer and Corporate Secretary, or Corporate Legal Secretary at Altus Group. And Teralyn is someone I've known, shall I say decades, Teralyn?
Decades. Yeah.
Well, let's just keep it there.
I was two.
And I'm really keen to hear, but I also want to say welcome back to Canada. I know that you were away for a little bit, so it's good to have you back.
Good to be back.
And last but not least, Dominic Cole-Morgan, who I had the pleasure of meeting as well, who is the Senior Vice President of Total Rewards at ScotiaBank. And just a note about ScotiaBank, who's been a long-time partner of us at the Canadian Women's Foundation. The virtual ink is yet to dry on an $800,000 contribution to the Canadian Women's Foundation over the next 4 years to support women's economic development. So thank you for that.
Oh, no, we're very excited. Very excited. Thank you. Thank you for everything you do.
Yes. Okay, so let's jump right in because time is not enough. So 30 years of gender equality gains have been impacted, lost, shifted for the past 2 years since the pandemic began. And clearly it's caused some shakeups. So could you share with us what some of these shakeups have been at Scotiabank? And I'll ask the same question of all the panelists.
Sure. So when I was thinking of this, I looked at our retention numbers and turnover for men and women. And actually, women are not leaving in any greater numbers than men. But I took absolutely no comfort with that, because what we hear through our employee feedback, through both the surveys, but also directly to us colleagues in HR, is that the roles outside of the role of colleague or employee that women are having to undertake have become significantly more challenging. So the role of caregiver for children, the role of caregiver for elders, and so what we've appreciated is actually, whilst women aren't deselecting themselves out of the workforce, that we need to create the workforce where women are able to thrive and progress. And that was really around providing supports in relation to childcare, but also elder care. We've just recently announced a new elder care benefit, which has emergency cover, because realistically, it's predominantly women who undertake all these activities. We've also doubled down on the progression through the organisation, because a concern that we've got, and it'd be great to hear from panellists on this, is that with the return to office and the hybrid situation that we're currently in, that men will be more likely to come in, and actually our surveys are backing up that men are effectively more likely to go back into the office and women to stay at home, because it does give the opportunity to juggle those caring responsibilities. And also, as what we want to be very conscious of is that we aren't, as a result, creating a culture where progression is based on presenteeism or visibility, and that's a huge concern for us. So we are doubling down on other elements or other scenarios which will help us or help the women in the organisation to progress, and that would be through very specific sponsorship programs. We've shifted away from mentorship much more to a sponsorship, because mentorship has a place, and it's a lot around sort of conversations, but sponsorship was actually about a very specific advocacy, and so we've doubled down on sponsorship in relation to one of the ways of ensuring that women are advocated in any sort of promotional or progression type conversation. And then we've really looked at our recruitment processes as well, to make sure that our panels of both the interviewer but also the suite are representative and have a minimum number of women on those panels. Because if you only have one woman on the panel, they're very unlikely to get the job. If you have more than one woman on the panel and more than one woman in the cadre, then the odds are incrementally much higher. So we've focused on a number of the systemic things around the pandemic, but I think the overarching concern is twofold. One is around the fact that women have multiple roles, and probably often more roles than men to play in society, especially around the caregiving. But second is the presenteeism and the visibility of the return to office. And I haven't said we've got a solution on those, but those are areas that are concerned for us.
Thank you. So, Taryn, could you talk about what you're doing with respect to where we are now and the shakeups that you're seeing at Altus?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we've been doing, like you've been doing at ScotiaBank, is looking very closely at attrition, retention, and promotion of women in our organizations. And what we're focused on are really sort of two things. One is resourcing programs for women. What we found, and we're fortunate, a lot of organizations, I think, with the pandemic, lack of revenue coming in, had to cut resources. We were fortunate we didn't cut them, but what we found is we needed more because of a lot of the issues that you talked about. And so we looked at, what can we do? What more can we do? And so one of the things we've launched is a mentorship program specifically for women. And really the goal of that is to say, let's take other women, other allies from around the organization globally, and make sure they're connected with women to check in on how they're doing with career, coaching, et cetera. So that's one thing. The other one, very similar, kind of out of sight, out of mind. So we're seeing, yes, more men are coming in to the organization, which means there's a risk for women being passed up for promotions. And so we're doing something our CHRO is calling intentional conversations. And that's really making sure that we've got a program that's virtual, that allows women and everyone at home really to connect into the office, whether it's fireside chats with executives, increased town halls, just ways to feel more connected to the company and to what's happening in the organization.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And later on, I'm going to ask about how do you know that these measures are working, but let's hear more about shakeups. Megan?
We've seen a lot of positive change, actually. So I came into the role of CEO in January 2020, a couple of months before the pandemic. And subsequent to that, we really changed over a significant amount of our team. We've done different things like flexible work hours. So our core hours are 9:30 to 2:30. So it gives you the flexibility to go drop off your kids from school or pick them up afterwards. We have a lot of people now in the senior team who are women or members of different underrepresented groups. So we've been having the conversations on a pretty ongoing and regular basis around what are the challenges you're facing and how can we address those. We've tried to do things like normalization. So when the pandemic first hit, my kids were home. I was homeschooling just like everybody else was homeschooling. And we made it normal to say, you know what, I need to take 5 minutes, step away from the computer and go deal with what's happening in my home life. So part of it for us, I think, has been about the cultural development. Really, how do you encourage people to have those open and honest conversations? How do you show individuals when you are in a leadership role as a female or somebody else, show that vulnerability yourself also, show the challenges you're facing so it makes people feel comfortable flagging those challenges also. And then how do you think about the types of flexibility that is needed now to be reflectful of the fact that women are taking on a bigger burden in home life and in work life, and then putting some of those policies in place to address it.
Mm-hmm. So important to be doing and to be having that support from the top as well.
Absolutely.
And Sonja.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also very happy to say that we haven't seen a shakeup. I think it's because going into the pandemic, if I put myself back in those shoes, I was really concerned that we would, see maybe the efforts pull back just because of the environment. So we almost put extra effort that we don't, and as a result, we've actually seen more progress. So maybe I'll take the question rather than repeating, because of course, we do a lot of the things that you've just mentioned. But if I take a step back, so for those that don't know us, we're just over 1,400 people between Toronto and Montreal offices. And when we look at the gender representation, we're almost essentially at the market labor representation for women, which, around 45%, we're just a touch below that. And then we take a look at it and say, okay, if you look at it through the career path, what does that look like? We're at parity for our junior staff. We're beyond parity for senior management. 6 of my 9 executives are women. And it's really in this middle around, early to mid female talent that we feel that we need to do more. Because it's very important to pay attention there, because that's the succession for the senior management. If we don't put the efforts there, then the beyond parity we have at the senior management level, well, it can be shaken, right? So what we've done really there, and it's through discussions with our employees, it's exactly as someone mentioned, women like to have development programs that are dedicated to them. It's a safe space where they can, focus time on issues that are very, top of mind for them. And we actually launched a program like that in the pandemic, which you think would be really hard to do. Mm-hmm. We did it. We actually partnered with one of our other network countries in Switzerland. It was a pilot, and it was so successful that we just did part 2 with Switzerland, Portugal, and Brazil. So not only does it support our Canadian women, but we actually brought some incremental cultural differences to the table, just, given the international presence of the bank.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. And it would be great to kind of dig down a little bit into that maybe later in our conversation in terms of how that's worked throughout, and now we're at this part of the pandemic as well. The next question, I'm going to start with you, Terlin. If you could talk a little bit about one of the things that we saw happen during the pandemic, aside from the shift that we saw happening, is spikes. And one of the areas that we saw based on the work we do is a spike in gender-based violence. And I don't know how many of you have seen the Signal for Help that we created at Canadian Women's Foundation, but that was one of the ways that we created to help keep people safe. And in your respective organizations, I'm curious about what are some of the things that you have done to enable people to identify that they need help, as well as to keep them safe from whatever. It could be harassment, it could be any other thing. So what are some of the measures that you've put in place to keep folks safe?
Yeah.
Or to let them know they can ask for help?
Absolutely. So this all, and you'll hear this a lot when I talk, this is all toned from the top. I mean, this stuff, if your senior leadership isn't taking this seriously, it's not going to happen. And so as part of these intentional conversations we've been having, we've been doing spotlights on mental health, bringing in experts to discuss. We've had colleagues, senior managers coming in and doing virtual conversations about mental health, about seeking help, about support. one thing we need to do, and we're looking at doing, is training for managers. I mean, everyone has sort of the standard harassment training, but I think what's really important for your people managers is to understand the indicia of a crisis or issues, and then help them prepare the tools. I mean, I'll always say it's not the company's job, right? Obviously, but I think having a healthy workplace, having women feeling safe and healthy, benefits the company, benefits society, and most of us spend far more time with our managers and colleagues than we do with our spouses. So, we're in a position where we really know we're close to our colleagues, and I think we do have an obligation to just be able to recognize the signs and point them in the right direction for help. So something I think we need to work on is helping our people managers with that.
Thank you. Dominic?
So, I mean, very specifically, we have some training courses which are around sort of recognizing where there's workplace violence. What we've broadened a discussion across the organization over the last year or so, actually it's a year in January, is around allyship. And we've partnered with New York University in relation to this. And they've introduced us to a sort of what they call the allyship triangle, which is, there's three elements. There's the source of non-inclusive behavior, there's the recipient of it, and there's the witness. And from that, we've built some training courses and some modules which our senior leadership have worked through and we've worked through with the organization, which is really around how do you react if you see non-inclusive behavior happening, and it could include sort of harassment. How do you intervene with the individual who's the recipient, but also with the person who's the perpetrator? And also, because actually we all end up in all corners, all three bits of the triangle at times, if you're the individual who has done that, how do you respond? And so we found this empathy triangle, as we called it, very helpful in creating a framework that would allow employees to have a discussion in a more structured way and to call out behavior that was non-inclusive, and support the recipient, support the person who is having it, i.e. I saw you doing such, I didn't like what you said in the meeting, I think it was it was incorrect of you to do so, or actually reflecting your own behavior. So we use the empathy triangle and allyship as one of those elements. The other thing we rolled out specifically on a gender basis, because the allyship thing was around all equity deserving groups. The other thing we rolled out, which was much more specific on the gender thing, was a course called Men Advocating for Real Change. It was, again, another partnership course. Mm-hmm. I mean, I went through it myself, and I have to say it was one of the most eye-opening courses I've been on, in that it made you think about what headwinds do women have that men don't have. And it was through the examples that were provided by colleagues. And I mean, the one that always I think about it all the time now is I park the car wherever I want to park the car. I park the car nearest the exit, wherever it is. And I don't think about, oh, is there a light there? Where do I get through? What's my route through? And so I think it was that's a small example, but it was really to demonstrate the headwinds from a gender perspective that men just don't think about because we don't have those headwinds. And then how might those manifest in the workplace, and what might you do to be a better ally? So through two very specific training courses or training interventions, we're looking to expand the understanding of our employees, and especially men on the second one, but all employees around how can you be a better ally to all elements, the person who's received the non-inclusive behavior, or even the source of it, or yourself if you were the source of it too. And actually we've found it been very helpful to give us that narrative when things have gone wrong in the organization, to use that triangle and the terminology to explain it, have a conversation in a very non-confrontational way that then helps the people understand how can we be better in relation to supporting our colleagues and specifically on the advocating will change our female colleagues.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about how that is leading to some sort of cultural shift within your organization, and what kind of conversations are they leading to that would not be normal to be having?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's toned from the top. So one thing we've done is that we started with our senior leadership team. So they've been through a number of interventions, and they have then cascaded that through some of the elements of the organization. We also presented it, the board wanted to hear about it, so I presented at the board, and the colleague from New York University came in. So there's been, as you say, this enormous tone from the top around allyship, and we've also weaved it into our recognition programs. Whenever we have the set piece, the elements during the year. So for example, Black History Month or Pride Month, or all the other elements as well, like Indigenous or the gender-based ones, we've included in that. Okay, this is Pride, but how can you be an ally to the LGBT community? Here is the gender-based ones. How can you be an ally to women? So we've tried to weave it through all the different elements of the organisation, so it becomes kind of self-reinforcing and self-affirming that actually everyone's role is to be an ally in this organisation. What's the benefits for us organisation? But the key thing, I think, as you said, is tone from the top. It had to come from the top. It wasn't something we could start within HR or just within middle management. It had to come from the top.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Megan.
I mean, I think one of the things the commonalities we're talking about is culture. So I think that we have a lot of similarities in terms of, I think, the types of things and training we're trying to do. But I think the one thing that we're really emphasizing is how can you create an open and honest culture such that people feel willing to be able to bring these issues to you. And so an example of something that I do, which is very simple, is I regularly send out company-wide emails. We have about 2,500 employees. I send out company-wide emails and I just say, I want to know how you're doing. Send me a note. I'm happy to chat. Let's have a Zoom. Let's have a coffee. And interestingly enough, the first couple of times you send those out, no one responds. You know what I mean? Or someone says, I'm good, or something like that. And then you start to eventually get people who start to say, I would like to talk. I do have an issue, and this isn't specifically related to gender-based violence, but someone said to me, a store manager sent me a note, it was last year, and said, I don't have an issue specifically on this, but I'd like to flag to you that when we do our post-customer surveys, we only ask, are they male or female? We don't ask if they're non-binary. And why do we do that? And I think that should change. And so I said, that's fantastic, thank you. I will immediately bring it to so-and-so, we'll make that change. And I think you have to both show have a willingness to discuss it, as well as a willingness to make change if they're gonna come to you for it. And then I think the second thing that we're also focused on, a little bit, as you mentioned, kind of around the training, is also understanding where we're experts and where we're not. And so really educating our employees on, what are the services we have, what employee benefits we have, and when you identify or someone comes to you and flags a sign to you, who should you take that to? Mm-hmm. You're not the expert to solve it because, we're not psychiatrists, we're not, et cetera, but how do you know who you should get it to and how can you get it there the fastest? And so we've been doing a lot of different things in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And I think all three of you have mentioned training. And one of the things that we've been asked by some of our corporate partners to do, particularly around our signal for help and other areas, is because it's not easy. And if you don't have not just the commitment, but the level of expertise to talk about issues, then it's very difficult to know how to engage. So we've been asked by some of our corporate partners to come in and talk about some of the work that we do, talk about how to enter into the conversations. The creation of our signal for help is an example of that. And so, but I know that within your own environments, that there are your own kind of creations that you developed. And so, Sonja, I'm wondering what kinds of similar initiatives have you created that you see that's been very helpful in entering into some of these conversations? I notice you've created a number of different groups along different equity-seeking groups. You mentioned the importance of intersectionality or non-binary as an example of that. But what are some of the initiatives that you've been able to accomplish?
Yeah, sure. Look, the employee resource groups play a fundamentally important role in, bringing diversity, equity, inclusion into the organization's culture. There's no doubt that the tone from the top is important. But if I look at the executive committee versus our 1,400 people, that's a small group. I look at the next, layer of management, that's 200 people. We come together, we talk about all these initiatives. But again, you see the percentage. It's really how do you engage the whole organization, and that's the ERGs. Mm-hmm. So what we've really done there is spent time in ensuring that they have a strategic approach in how they serve their members, but also support the D&I strategy of the firm.
Right.
And what we basically asked them to do is to look at their activities through 4 lenses. One is around awareness and education. Another one is around social responsibility, recruiting, of course, working with the talent acquisition team and HR and other partners, and then acceleration, which goes back to partnerships. Because as you look at to identify, what are the obstacles do we have and how do we bridge them, you need those partnerships, and the certifications that we have pursued have been some of the partnerships that we've engaged with. So for example, the employee group that's focused on women has worked very closely on the Women in Governance Parity certification that we pursued. And our Pride team worked on the Rainbow accreditation. Maybe not a typical role for an employee resource groups, but they really were fully engaged together with the members and the management team. So I know you mentioned before, some things cannot be just the work of HR. And I think bringing D&I into the culture, it cannot be the work of just HR. It is a partnership between business and HR, and then carried through the organization through the employee resource groups. That's our view.
Okay.
And it's tough to deal with culturally too, right? Because I think we all work in global organizations. And so trying to do this, we had a situation where we were doing these conversations. We were in another country, and one of the executive who was gay was talking about an increase in violence against the LGBT community during the pandemic. And the feedback we got later was, we don't talk about that here.
Wow.
This is an open conversation. And so we had to take that back and say, well, we're not, we're trying to create a culture of openness and, people feeling free to have discussions and come forward and ask for help. And you have to kind of do that in the framework of your, of your culture, the cultures globally. So anyway, I don't have an answer, but it was an interesting piece.
I'm glad you brought that up because, I think it's one of those inevitable shifts that's happening as a result of folks having to make significant shifts in their lives due to the pandemic, whether it's working from home or figuring out how to continue to be productive, but also being connected in a different way, and having had experiences that haven't been normal, but having to have those conversations. Right? So unusual conversations around their lives. And so perhaps going back to the norm is not going to be the way to go.
Yeah.
Right? And so figuring out how to have open conversations and have people bring their full selves into their work. And I think you and I talked about that, Megan, in terms of what that's like for people to bring their full selves into and how they feel more open and accepted. In being able to do that. So I think that's what we're trying to move towards in terms of our workplaces and have greater opportunity for meaningful engagement, I think. So the next question I want to ask is shifting a little bit to looking at the experiences of diverse women, diverse folks, diverse gender, diverse folks, and the challenges that they have faced in terms of their labor force participation. We know from the examples of the pandemic, for example, with respect to those who care for us during the pandemic have been folks who don't make enough in terms of having living wages and having to do more than 1 or 2 or 3 jobs in order to make ends meet. But also that they have faced the greatest barriers. They have the longest to wait in terms of ever achieving gender equality. We heard in a panel just earlier this afternoon where someone quoted our stats with respect to how many hundreds of years it's going to take for us to achieve gender equality. And so there is an understandable refusal to accept that that's okay. But we know that depending on your backgrounds, right, depending on how you look, your ability, et cetera, that is a longer goal for you than others. So culture change is just as important, we know, as structural or systemic change. And so I'm curious about you sharing with us, how do you shift culture and equity and inclusion in your work environments? Why don't we start with you, Megan?
Sure. I think it's a multifaceted question. I think that, we've talked about the importance of culture coming from the top. I think that representation also matters. I think I've said this before. I think that you can't, build an inclusive culture if you don't have an inclusive team, right? And I think, one of the big shifts that I had made when I came in is we joke around that before the company is run by kind of 3 gyms, and now it's 3 women. And so I have a female CFO, I have a female chief product officer, a significant portion of my team is female, but they're not just all white females. You know, I mean, we have a lot of also diversification in terms of where they come from. Some people are immigrants. It's just diverse, right? And so I think by having different people at the table, you have different conversations, right? And then that filters down into thinking more strategically about, well, how are we hiring? You mentioned, you know, your backgrounds. A lot of people, you know, I was previously in private equity, and the hiring would be, well, what school did you go to? And that was the key criteria. You know, that stuff doesn't really matter, right? It really should matter, can you do the job? So we've shifted to things like doing case studies. So, you know, we kind of like, that evens everyone out. The question is, can you do the job? Not, do I like you? And not, you know, who's your father? Or where did you go to school? You know, those things are, so I think that stuff is important. And then I think the third thing around the culture building is that you have to also understand where the power dynamics lie. And I think we talked about this a little bit in some previous conversations that, you know, when you think about the types of industries that we're all in, I'm a public company, I was previously in finance, you know, in that reality, my shareholders are quite important to influencing what happens at my company. You know, the investors, the LP community, limited partners, they can influence private equity. And, you know, sometimes when you're trying to, you know, crack up the current reality of the institution, you have to also think about who has the most power to influence that. And I think we have to think about how there are constituents out there who can have more influence on changes in gender equality than just the companies themselves.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you pinpointed the importance of identifying, acknowledging power and influence, because it really is an important ingredient to being able to make that cultural shift.
I think so.
Sonja.
I mean, look, to shift culture, I think you got to walk the talk, right? I think the pitfall is that organizations talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but, you know, there's maybe in real action, there's not as much as the talk. And then do you have the feedback loop? How is it perceived? How is it lived by your staff, right? And is it leading to the outcomes that you were looking for as you started some of the initiatives, right? And I think it's really important to have that full feedback loop. You know, for us at BNP Paribas, a global organization focused on gender across the globe, you know, I'm really happy to say that, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion is part of the culture. And because it is, you're then able to embed it in all that we do. So recruiting, promotion process, development programs, celebrating it through the employee resource groups, right? You name it. But I think it is a special position to be in, and it does require attention. Though you can't take it for granted. You know, our employee base is changing. I think all industries have seen turnover. So, you know, the work that has been done, you got to keep on doing it. So it is about that steady effort as well versus, you know, quick wins, because I think it's a journey. I think it's work that continues going.
Yeah, what an important point you've made around the journey. And I think that's one of the themes I've heard over the past 3 days with respect to this is not a one-time and done thing, that it is ongoing work. And it's that systemic change is not just about creating something and having it take care of itself, that you need to take care of it in order for it to stay and last and actually create the change that you seek. What about how you're doing that work at
it's a great question, and changing a culture is never easy. I mean, for us, I think it's around understanding what the barriers are that are preventing whatever solution by progression or retention or representation, and addressing those. So, for example, you're putting in childcare provision or elder provision, but I think also around communicating really clearly. So, for example, doing your gender pay gap analysis and then publish it. So even if it's not great, publish it. Okay, it's 94, it's terrible, we want to move on. I think ours, fortunately, is better than that. And being sort of really sort of transparent around what is important to the organisation and that congruent messaging. For example, we changed our parental leave coverage, and both for the birth parent and the non-birth parent. And the non-birth parent was a real focus for us because what we wanted was fathers, ostensibly, to take longer parental leave, and then for that to, I hate this word, but to normalise that period of time spent with your child. So, of course, as soon as the first few started taking this leave, we had them in videos and with their beautiful babies and talking about how wonderful this experience was. But actually, it was to demonstrate that you can do this and you can still be successful in the organisation. There isn't a one-size-fit-all way of progressing through the organisation. So, for me, I think you have to make the structural changes you want to do the analysis you need to do, and then communicate it so that people understand that it's something that's important to you. And also you have to be congruent in terms of how you operate as an organisation. I mean, it's no news, it's in the press, but we withdrew our sponsorship from Hockey Canada very publicly, and that was around sexual violence. So we had to, as an organisation, take a stand against that. And if we hadn't, then our employees rightly would have said, well, where are you standing on this? You sponsor them. So you have to be, it's not only the right thing to do, you have to make sure that you communicate in a very congruent way, but also that employees understand culturally that this is important to you. And we've been looking to include more of our diversity statistics. We have targets about all the equity deserving groups and a sense of belonging. And we've been looking to include that in how we determine the bonus pool each year. And that's a pretty clear communication. The organisation thinks this is important because money is now going to be at stake in relation to that for not only our most senior people, but the entire organisation. So it's that sort of congruence of messaging. But I do think there is something around things like the gender, the parental leave, that saying there is more than one way of being successful in this organisation, and it isn't purely by a man working from sort of 6 a.m. till 9 o'clock at night without ever talking about his family. I mean, that is just not how we can progress through the organisation. So it's a lot around the communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true. I think you and I were talking about the importance of men taking parental leave as well, and how but who would think that in 2022 that would actually be a bold move?
I know.
It's sad, it really is. Yeah.
Right, but it is because of the culture that we've allowed to continue as is for so long. Mm-hmm. So what about at Altus?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on your point, and we had started this talking about not just thinking about women, but thinking about women with other characteristics and traits. And your point about doing the root cause analysis, I think we have to realize that when we're doing root cause analysis on women in our workforce, that it's not just about women. And the whole notion of intersectionality, which I'm sure most of you know, but the idea that systems of inequality based on gender or gender identity or sexual orientation or other ableness, race, there's an intersection. And so if somebody is a Black woman and is getting paid less, when you're doing that analysis, it's not just about that person being a woman, but how much of it is about that person being Black, and how can you distinguish? So I think it's important to think about this in a broad perspective when you're doing that analysis. And then I'm going to go back to the age-old, the adage that we always hear in business, right? What gets measured gets done. So you want to change culture, we put the programs in place. I'm about to rant. Remember we talked about the rant? So,
you're doing well. Keep going.
we always hear, we want to grow earnings by 10%, right? So what happens? The whole executive is incented to do it. And we can tweak that incentive. We want you to grow in this geography. We want you to, cross-sell. We want you to introduce more products and services. So we can incent to that perspective. What about incenting in the same way for programs? What if we had an incentive that, the executive gets a special bonus for having more female promotions, increasing the promotions of females by 10%. And there has to be more than that. But I think that's a start. And I've never understood sort of why we don't apply the same concepts when we want to get financial other measures done to the culture change we want to see, which is, by the way, going to absolutely help the financial perspective.
And your investors are expecting it now as well. I mean, that's the key thing.
They're asking
a lot of discussions we have are around how are you incenting your management team and the rest of the organization to deliver on your climate goals, your representation
Absolutely.
goals. And it's great. I'm delighted they're doing it because it gives us the power to then go back and say, this is important.
I love when the investors do that because the next thing you know, let's talk about this. We got asked about it.
Incentivizing for gender equity.
Yes.
I love that.
Can I just add one more thing
Yes.
to this, which I think is interesting, that one of the things that this incentive structure brings up is the fact that it makes you focus on it the whole year round. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of what has happened over the last couple of years is that specific issues have come up, and then people are like, well, now I have to focus on this during Black History Month, or this during Women's History Month, or this during X month, and then the rest of the year, it's like it doesn't happen, right? And so I think this concept of creating incentives throughout the whole year, or organizations making sure that the activities they're doing, whether it's through ERGs or others, are happening regularly, is a really important cultural change also. It's not just about a moment in time, it's about integrating it into the culture on an ongoing basis, and finding different ways to do that, I think is really essential.
Yep.
That's amazing. That's great. So the next question I have is touching up on the risk and opportunity moment that I think we're still in You know, we've had 2+ years of this pandemic, but it's also created what we call at the foundation an opportunity to reset normal, to not go back to the way things are because that's the way it always was, but to seize the moment that we're in to reset and create a new normal, one that we can aspire to, but also achieve. Because sometimes aspirations, we don't achieve it, but we hold it as aspirations only. So we can also achieve it. So we're looking at what are the ways that organizations are grappling with that particular opportunity to reset certain things within their organization, but also what more needs to happen. So I'm curious about how do you know, and I hinted to this earlier on, how do you know that all the initiatives that you're putting in place, as you said earlier, Terrell, what gets measured gets done? Maybe what gets paid for gets done, but that's another story. But if what gets measured gets done, so how do you know that what you're doing, which all sound great, right? But how do you know they're working? I'm going to go back because I'm looking at you. So
No. Shouldn't have caught your eye. It's a great question. I think your description of companies grappling with this is right because it is complicated. I mean, for us, we measure it through our representation numbers. So are we improving them? We have targets for all our equity deserving groups, and some we're making good progress on and some we are stalling. And then we have to understand why. So that's that, you know, we track constantly, quarter, how are we doing against each of our diversity group targets. Then there is the employee opinion survey, which we're now, because we've got a really good handle, and this is, if I have any advice for people if they're on this journey, is get as much information as you can on your workforce. So get people to identify as the equity deserving groups, because we went from about sort of 30% of our population filling in that part to just under 90%, I think now. And so now we have a really, really good idea that we can cut our employee opinion survey by and understand that actually these groups are less engaged or feel they belong less. And we're able to then actually the other thing we did was we asked people if they would be comfortable to be contacted. So they basically waived their anonymity. And then when we see those results, we now go and speak to focus groups through all the ERGs. So I think you have to get the data baseline. So you have to have a way of collecting information on sense of belonging, engagement, but then being able to cut by the equity deserving groups. And then to your point, the intersections of those as well, because we did see, for example, where you intersect gender and ethnicity, that we were seeing some really sharp drop-offs. So you sort of reassure yourself, oh, look, gender is fine. But when you start applying the intersection lens, it became quite stark in some places. So get the data right. I think that just to get back to your grappling point, and one thing I thought was a great description, is we need to not go back to how it was before. We had a couple of years of having this relaxation to a certain degree of what was considered appropriate in the organisation, where you saw people's children in the background and you saw the guitars hanging up on the wall or whatever. You got an insight into people's lives, and it was a lot more in it. And you know, productivity did not drop off. And so how do we fight those very strong norming effects of we need to go back to what it was before, which is everyone sitting in suits like I am in an office somewhere in downtown Toronto. And that's what good organisations do to actually know it seems to work perfectly well if these people are working remotely or are working flexibly. And because that opens up enormous talent pools that you maybe haven't got before. If people could just work sort of between the school hours, or we can employ people in the Northern Territories, and that would help with our Indigenous numbers, or people, you know, where are our tech people? They're in this location. So I don't know, I haven't got the answer, but the grappling is a great one. How do we stop ourselves just going back to that old, outdated structure which didn't support the needs of a broader, diverse workforce who are very productive as well? I haven't got the answers, so I'm dying to hear what they are.
and it can be tempting. I think you're hinting at the temptation to do what you've always done, but trying to not do that.
There will be huge norming and impacts of everyone. Well, it worked before, or it was easier for me because everyone was outside my office and I could just go out and talk to people. It doesn't. As a leader, it's a much more difficult role to be in. I think you have to learn different leadership skills, and you have to think about how you communicate your culture. But there is huge advantages of it, of access to talent pools you haven't previously been able to access.
It is a real test of a different approach to leadership as well. Sonja, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess our attention point is, as I mentioned, we have, a number of new joiners, so we got to integrate them into the culture that we have built, right? But when you have quite a few people joining you over the past 2.5 years virtually, there's work to be done. So I mentioned earlier, that I sort of look at the efforts that we do as sort of steady state effort, but that doesn't mean you're focused on the same things. You got to figure out, where do I need to tweak it? Of course, we've got the annual plan. Of course, we've got the 3-year plan. But you got to be able to be nimble enough to tweak it, right, and flexible enough. In terms of how do we know how we're doing, so we did a survey at the end of last year, so I brought a few stats that I thought I'd share with the crowd. So 89% of our employees believe that they can be themselves at work, which I thought was pretty good. Would love it to be above 90, but I think 89 is quite good. 93% said that they actively support our D&I initiatives.
That's great.
I thought that was fantastic. 91% are comfortable to raise concern around inappropriate conduct, which is very important culturally speaking. And then sort of one of the lower numbers was, and I'm happy to share, is an area that we still have work to do, which is 82%, this was specific to women, in their response, they believe that there's more work that needs to be done around gender equity in recruiting and promotion. So to me, this is real feedback, right? That, you take it and you now look at your processes and everything that we have been working on to see what else can we do. We also had some, open-ended questions to ask them, what else do you want? And basically they asked for 3 things. They want more manager training, and we touched on the topic around training earlier. The employee resource groups, the networks, want even more support, which we continue to provide, but it's one of those things that always continues. And they're really keen for cross-industry initiatives. And it's really interesting because this panel is cross-industry, so there are common challenges and opportunities that we face, but our day-to-day reality is quite different. So I was encouraged by the feedback, but the thing that I can do is take it for granted that the next time we do the survey, it'll be as strong or stronger. I think it's work between now and then that's going to help to get there.
I love the transparency that you're bringing into this conversation, which is an important element as well.
Yeah.
Megan.
We do a lot of the same things, so I'm going to actually answer a different question.
Okay.
But I think that one of the things you asked in your question was like the concern about going back to normal.
Right.
And I'd like to challenge the fact that that was normal. I think the reality is that if normal is having less than 5% of the public company CEOs in Canada female, that's not normal, right? That was the abnormal period, and now we have to think about what normal looks like.
Right.
And so I think that if the important thing about it is the measurement's important. I think having the conversations, I think not just having the conversations with women, I think having men as part of the conversations. I think those power dynamics, I think thinking about where we can kind of leverage more people to come into the conversation to make it a topic that's a constant issue that we're always bringing to the forefront. I think those are important. And I think those are the things that, outside of the measurements that we do pulse surveys, we do all these types of things too. We're trying to just make sure the conversation doesn't die. We're trying to make sure that it's constantly something we're bringing to the forefront, and also making sure that people feel that they can internally, and in the conversations that they're having with different counterparties, talk about challenging what normal really is.
Okay. Well, I have 3 minutes, so I'm going to come to you, but then I have one more question that's hopefully is going to be a quick fire question. So why don't you answer this one, then we'll go to the next question.
Yeah, I would talk about the opportunity, and I don't remember who touched on it, but the fact that we can work remotely, I think it's broadened our horizons to workforces that we haven't tapped into. So I can give you 2 examples of what we've done. It's early, so I can't tell you success, but I just think it was great because we were able to tap into young people that we would never have gone to before. So one, and this was just an employee of ours on his own in Calgary, had reached out to a group that was looking to introduce more Black and Indigenous people into the real estate industry. And so they were talking to groups within local colleges and universities, and we trained them on our proprietary software. We had them with internship programs, and we've just been able to hire a great group of people. They've just started at the organization, but completely engaged, came into the organization knowing about us already. And then something similar was done in the US with historical Black colleges, where there was an internship program. They went through an 8-month program, and 100% of them have stayed with the organization. I think it's now been 18 months. All the reports are they're doing amazingly well. So there's this great opportunity to go out and be just really different and open our minds to a workforce that maybe we haven't looked at before. And it's a great opportunity to get more women in the organization and promote and train more women.
Thank you for that. I remember that one of our universities, I think it's UBC and perhaps TMU here in Toronto, are looking at similar kinds of programs in terms of recruitment into programs, but also to increase the number of diverse folks in programs as well. So I look forward to hearing how some of these programs unfold in terms of their success. So my last question that you have only a few seconds each to answer. I'm interested in what is one of the things that have wowed you in terms of a particularly bold move for gender equity? And I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So it came up earlier in the conversation. So may or may not be bold enough for you, but I think it's really important. And I think it goes back to the paternity leave. So I think to have something that is more cross-industry with a greater acceptance rate would go a far way. We introduced last year for all our employees 8 weeks, 100% pay. And there's a growing take-up on it. And, you know, I love it.
It's 100% pay. That's bold.
100% pay.
That is
correct.
Bold. Right.
And you know, years ago, someone mentioned to me and said, if gender equity were all, and that it's not there, we're all about having babies, you know, we would have made more progress.
Right.
And I actually think it's a lot about that because of the comments you made early on around how much care is provided by women, children, and elderly. So I actually think it's a really important part of the
I'm out of time, but a word?
I think I have a lot of words. So I'm going to say, and the shortest thing I'd say is that I think if we can maintain this hybrid workforce and actually use it in a way that can continue to promote women and allow them to have the flexibility to still balance what is the reality of work and life, and I think that will be a bold move if it actually succeeds.
Right. Carolyn?
I think things have to be mandated. And so, you know, we've left organizations to try and do this. It's not being done. When the Ontario Securities Commission required disclosure for women on boards, suddenly it became a priority to get women on your boards. So regulators, let's start mandating.
Thank you. And finally,
I would say company and governmental childcare.
okay, love it. Great way to end. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. Okay, yes. So let me do that now because she's on the side and ready to come on up. So let me just take a moment to introduce our Minister in Ontario, Honourable Charmaine Williams, Minister of Women, Ontario, who will close with her final remarks for our panel. So welcome, Minister.
Hello. Oops. Thank you so much. Wow, these lights are bright, and I've been indoors all day. Just being able to sit back and listen to some of the conversation, it's really exciting for me. Right now, I do hold the Ministry of Women's Social and Economic Opportunities for the Government of Ontario, formerly called Women's Issues. And I'm so glad that they've changed the name because I am married and I say to my husband, my issues are your issues. So, but you've really touched on, all of you, and highlighted some key areas that can be a driver for change and will make environments better for women. So thank you for your input and your insight. I do have some words to share, so I'll dive right in. And I'm always given notes, and I will try my best to stick to them. But, you know, I'm very thrilled to be able to represent women in Ontario Provincial Parliament. You know, we know that we are at a critical time. Women have been disproportionately impacted by COVID, and their economic security has taken a significant hit. The pandemic highlighted a childcare crisis, and women bore the burden of caregiving activities and duties. There was also a sharp rise in the incident of domestic violence as well. Young mothers, mothers of young children, racialized women, single mothers, Indigenous women, immigrant women, women with disabilities, and women without post-secondary education have been most affected. They are underrepresented in many of the fastest growing and highest paying sectors, such as the STEM fields of science, technology, engineering, and math, as well as the skilled trades. We also know that women continue to be overrepresented in jobs that pay minimum wage and part-time employment. What I found, I've worked in children's mental health almost 20 years before getting into politics, and many of the women that I would work with would be stuck in this cycle of low-paying, precarious jobs. And when they are not empowered and have the financial security, it makes it more difficult for them to leave dangerous and violent homes. Women make up only 34% of the STEM bachelor's degree holders and only 23% of the STEM workforce. And we know that seeing women have skills and women who are in these dangerous environments and homes, when we empower them and provide pathways for them to develop these skills and training, we are making sure that we're changing not just their economic future, but their whole entire family's economic future. Data also shows that women disproportionately end up in lower paying technical roles in the STEM sector and not more highly paid professional ones. So when many women aren't participating in paid employment or are only working part-time, it's not just a woman's issue, it's an economic issue. We know that women have tremendous skills to offer employers and are able to help build Ontario's prosperity. That's why our government established Ontario's Task Force on Women in the Economy last term. The task force included diverse voices from the public, private, and non-profit sectors focused on following 3 key areas related to women's participation in economic growth. 1, supporting women as they enter and re-enter the workforce. 2, supporting women's entrepreneurship. And 3, removing barriers for women in underrepresented areas, including skilled trade and STEM fields. The work of the task force informs several key actions announced in the 2022 budget, and their input has continued to be top of mind. Our government is working to break down barriers and ensure that women are better represented in all spaces, all sectors, and at every table. We also know that women who are low income experience significant barriers to skills training. They lack financial resources to help replace the earnings while in training and lack access to affordable childcare. And we also know that women sometimes need mental health, legal, and housing supports to enter the workforce, and more importantly, stay there. So it's clear that there's a great deal of untapped opportunity for women in our economy. And the very fact that you're having these panel conversations and this conference is a testament of our rethinking of so much. This is a chance to, like you said, push the reset button. Push that reset button on women and work, because the status quo is not working. As Associate Minister, one of my key priorities is supporting women's economic security and prosperity to help women across the province thrive at home, at work, and in their communities. But to achieve this, first and foremost, women need to be safe. And I had an opportunity to go out to Thunder Bay. And if you haven't had a chance to go out into some of these remote areas, it is so eye-opening, because things that we take for granted, like using the GPS to get to a location, women in the north have to print directions because there are areas that have no Wi-Fi and no data connection. So think about a woman and your safety when you're going through pockets with no access to anybody. We need to work on these things. As I mentioned earlier, domestic violence is also increased during COVID. In fact, it's become so prevalent worldwide that the UN nations has called it the shadow pandemic. I think we can all agree that safety is not a privilege, it's a right. That's why our government is committed to preventing and addressing violence against women in all forms, including human trafficking, and providing wraparound supports to help women who have been victims of these crimes heal and, most importantly, rebuild their lives. Last year alone, we invested nearly $300 million in services and supports for victims, in addition to $300 million invested over 5 years in an anti-human trafficking strategy. And you'd be blown away, especially during the 401 corridor and the different truck stops along the way. Human trafficking is it's such an issue that you might think it doesn't impact you, but it can, and we are doing what we can to make sure we're addressing and giving parents and people the tools to pick up on those signs and be able to access help when you need it. A holistic approach also includes providing access to childcare, which is why I'm so proud that we were able to sign a historic agreement with the federal government. We are the only province in Canada to sign a $13.5 billion agreement for the Canada-wide early learning and childcare system. It also requires that women have safe and stable, affordable places to call home, which is why we've put policies in place that have delivered historic results in getting more houses built faster. Plus, we have invested in target supports, such as helping survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking access housing. Another key aspect of this approach is the focus on mental health. And this is really important to me because I love the field I was in mental health services. As you know, the pandemic further brought to the forefront the importance of mental health and the need to openly speak about and address the challenges. I think everyone here can relate to the toll that the pandemic has had on our social, emotional, and mental health fabric. So that's why we've launched the Roadmap to Wellness in 2020. It's our provincial strategy that takes a whole of government approach to addressing long-standing mental health addictions needs with a historic investment of $3.8 billion over the next 10 years. A large portion of this strategy involves significantly involving the availability and quality of mental health and addiction supports to better connect Ontarians to the services they need. You know, as a mom, I'm a mom, I have 5 kids, and mental health was not just important for my kids, but it was for me as well. You know, we all know, and I consider myself to have skills because I worked in this field for so long, but I'm telling you, those moments when you mention having kids run up behind you and having insight into your lives, thank goodness for that mute button, because during the times, you know, it's true, because it gets so overwhelming sometimes when you're trying to do your meetings and you have your kids and then helping your kids through homeschooling. It was a difficult time. So, you know, I always encourage ourselves to be realistic about the state of mind that we're in and know that it is okay to not be okay sometimes. You know, so I think especially as women enter and re-enter the workforce and require supports, wraparound supports are so important. And I was very honored to be able to announce a really unique program called the Investing in Women's Futures program. And last month, I was able to announce the $6.9 million over the next 3 years in that program. And we have a call for proposals right now open until November 8th. If you have no organizations that would be able to provide wraparound supports. This program has a proven track record of supporting women facing social and economic barriers so that they can increase their confidence, build their skills and knowledge, and gain meaningful employment. Last year, it served more than 5,000 women across the province and helped more than 1,300 women secure employment and start their own business or pursue further training and education. While in Thunder Bay, I was able to meet with a group of women at Paro, and one of the women there was named Sarah. And she said, in her own words, and I quote, "I realize I can do a lot more than I thought I'm able and capable of. I just needed the proper education and support system with female mentors. I now feel my future will be different, and I'm able to build on my skills." That was so great to hear, because she was a woman that was on the street at one point in her life and was able to connect with Paro and build herself up to the point where she is now working with women. And that was through the Investing in Women's Futures program. The new investment we are making in this program is a part of our 2022 budget, Ontario's plan to build. And we will increase funding for the 23 women's centers currently offering the program and expand it to up to 10 more new centers across the province. So more women like Sarah can get the support and the launching pad that they need to be able to work for companies like yours. This is in addition to the $18 million we are already providing for the Investing in Women's Futures program and women's economic security programs over the next 2 to 3 years. Today's working class is more female than male, more likely to be an immigrant or racial minority, and much more likely to serve in likely to work in service sector jobs. More so, they frequently have more education experience than it is typical for the role that they are in. In other words, they are overqualified for the jobs. Yes, I see somebody shaking your head. Yes, it's true. So when we talk about the working class, we are overwhelmingly talking about women. So as we look ahead to the future of work for women in Ontario, we know that there's much work to be done, and we are committed to working with our partners across all sectors to do it. A foundation that also builds on the work of partners across sectors in education, business, healthcare, and community services. And as I delve further into the work of my ministry, I look forward to meeting with women in leadership roles to hear their views on the challenges women face and hear about their ideas on how to constructively move forward, like you ladies. It's so inspiring when I listen to other women, because I'm like, man, we can do so much. Just give the issue to us and we'll find a pathway forward, right? Ask a mom who has to make a school project or Halloween costume the day before it's due. We get it done, right? As I delve further, I was so dismayed to look. I was recently, yes, I read the MIT study that found women on average having higher performance ratings than men, but where they underperform is on their leadership potential ratings. So in other words, when women exceed expectations, they still don't get the benefit of the doubt. By and large, women are simply seen as having less potential for leadership than men. This potential gap results in women being seen as a riskier bet for leadership, even when the data suggests the exact opposite is true. We have to change our mindset. Not just women change our mindset that we can lead, we have to change the mindset of all industries seeing women in leadership roles. That's what that says to me. We have to change it. So to women across Ontario who are leaders, you too can support your female colleagues through discussions and mentorships. This way, we see more women ready to occupy senior management roles and have the belief within them that they can do it. Every dollar a company spends on inclusive and supportive practices is a dollar invested in a successful long-term workforce. We must continue to break down barriers for women at the bottom of the economy all the way up. And women must be at the forefront of the post-pandemic recovery. I hope we will all leave here today inspired to do more. I know I am. To encourage our sisters, our daughters, and neighbors, and those who identify to support women in our communities and organizations so they can reach new heights, and recognize that there are real barriers to the success of women, regardless of their social economic status. We owe it to ourselves to be the next generation to help more women and girls reach their full potential. Because when women succeed, Ontario succeeds. Thank you so much for listening to me today.